YouTube.
So if you're paid up and you've got the webinar levels, you can actually stream to Facebook and YouTube. I use a third-party software to run this then through that software, which pushes it to multiple sources.
Okay, after I get back from leave and you've got 10, 15 minutes, I'm in the area, I'd love you to show me how it all works.
Yeah. So it's taken a little bit of a fiddling thing. But yeah, it seems to be working. And for the one we did last week, Zoom was actually falling apart a little bit. So it wasn't pushing out streams. But things seem to be fixed again. G'day, Facebook. We are live on Facebook. That's always a good start. Good. Getting all the notifications that we're live everywhere. That's a good thing.
So Chad Gaff is watching.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
Louise is also watching, Cam.
Hello.
Live at oakbarrel.com.au/live. 11 people. G'day, chat on Facebook. How you doing, mate?
Hey, Scott, he's from WA. He's one of the exchange guys.
Oh, Chad?
Yeah.
It's knockoff time in WA, that's for sure.
Is it ever not?
It's probably 1 o'clock.
I've been looking to tee up some stuff with America, and trying to find times that work for both countries is a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
But that's all right. That's all right. Always a good time for a whiskey. You've missed out the Eon whiskey there, Chad. Could be a little bit of that tonight.
He is from Western Australia. And is an Eagles fan.
You need a separate passport to get into Western Australia at the moment, don't you?
You need a second head as well.
Savage.
So in your stuff you've been doing, Cam, has it been mainly whiskey focused in the past couple of weeks?
Predominantly, yeah. I mean, whiskey is a great isolation drink. I mean, a lot of us just drink it neater on the rocks. Doesn't interfere with your beer and wine goings on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easier to crack a bottle of whiskey and have a few fingers of whiskey than it is to like make gin and tonics and cocktails and all that jazz. So.
Yeah, I lasted about half an hour this weekend before I stopped measuring my martinis.
Yeah. We've done a little bit on gin and rum as well, but yeah, predominantly whiskey.
I was looking throughout the back Savo, looking for different things that we could play with, and got a little bit of Toki sitting out in the back still.
Yeah, nice.
I hope there's like a highball class we can do with Toki. And g'day to Bart coming in on the Zoom chat here. Just found the link, which is good. We'll kick off at about 6:30. Everyone that's coming in. So just take your seats, relax. Actually, I got some photos from last night from various people around New South Wales. Some of whom had dressed up, and some of whom had dressed down. Just like different photos of what people were wearing on their feet.
I have pants on again tonight, but it's definitely gone a level of more casual. That's for sure.
Yeah. And Chad's just alphaed me by saying he started with a pre-show maker's mark. So technically he spelt whiskey correctly. So yes, I stand.
Yeah, well played, Chaddy.
Mistaken, and I do apologise for any offence caused, and I endeavour to do better in future endeavours. So, Basil, Bakers. Interesting to see if we get a rowdy YouTube crew again tonight. That was good fun.
The nightclub.
Yeah, no idea what was going on, but it sounded like fun. Is there anything, is there more bookers coming into the country or anything exciting I should know about?
Okay, so bookers are still a once a year allocation.
When was that? That was January this year? Or was it last year?
No, it was June last year.
Yeah, Jesus, that's a long time ago.
So basically, New South Wales had 175 cases for on and off. And basically, I think I took care of 165 of them. I know a few people are still some squad, so if you really need some, I know I can reach out to them.
Oh, no, I wouldn't. Yeah, I don't.
Plenty of cool stuff in the States.
Dave Frain's tuned in on the YouTube saying, stop nigging on WA already. So looks like the YouTube chat might be already living up to its status as the loose one of the.
Go YouTube, we believe.
Yeah, the nightclub at 3 a.m.
Yeah. Well, judging on when we might be trying to tee some American stuff up, it might be 3 a.m. in one of the countries. We can do one of these next ones. Well, I'm thinking if we could do like a Saturday, 2 p.m. here is sort of like 9 p.m. over there the day before, or 1 p.m. sort of like 8 p.m., which isn't outside the realms of possibility. If you could sort of do it that way.
That'll work.
I believe in the internet.
I suppose it really comes down to which side you're going from. You're going from the east or the west.
Yeah. Can't they devolve some of America? It's quite big. Just get them down to one time zone. It'd be a lot simpler.
Just ask Trump.
if it's in the display, it's a very good chance that we actually don't have any more. You hold up the labels, you can just keep them in the display.
Is that hard tea, Scott?
Very hard tea.
Yeah, no, so
Blackgate Distillery grade hard tea. Dave and/or Carolyn Taylor from down in Tassie. G'day. How you doing? It's going to be a big night of programming here on the old Oak Barrel Live. I reckon I might be feeling pretty good by about midnight tonight.
Haven't you got better?
Yeah, Sarah, I'm not drinking the hand sanitizer yet, although the Bricks hand sanitizer is delicious. It is very good. So I've hung around enough distilleries to actually, quite like that sweet aroma of pure ethanol.
Hey, Cam, do you reckon Mr. Woolley will do a Highwayman hand sanitizer?
Probably not, but you can ask.
I know what the answer would be.
I reckon I might say that I might not stock any Highwayman products unless I can stock the Highwayman gin as well.
Yes, please do.
Just see how that one goes down.
And the vodka.
Yeah. Only flavoured vodka though. I want Byron Bay coconut flavoured Highwayman vodka.
Or even better, asking for the Irish version.
Oh dear. It's
Love
not
you,
going to
Dan.
end well. It's not going to end well. All right, well, look, I've got 6:29 by my clock, so that's close enough to me.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. G'day and welcome everyone that's watching across the Zoom, Facebook and YouTube channels. My name is Scott Fitzsimons and it is my pleasure to welcome you from far and wide to another virtual whiskey tasting tonight as we delve deep into America and Kentucky with bourbon whiskey. Now, I think sometimes in Australia, bourbon whiskey can be a little bit, a few misconceptions about bourbon and what actually differentiates bourbon, particularly with such a strong, sort of local domestic spirits drinking habits that has predominantly been mixed throughout the last 50 or 60 years, and then sort of the boom of Scotch. Some things correlate to bourbon and some things don't. So tonight we're really going to be drilling down into just some basics of bourbon, but the sets that we've set out to people are certainly not entry level or bourbons. There's some pretty hardcore stuff we're going to be going through tonight. As I would normally do at this point, I would point out the toilets and the water source and don't drive home, but I have no idea where you are and where your toilets are and where your water source is. So I'm going to leave that one up to you guys for tonight. If you are drinking along with us and have one of the sets, they are 50 mils. We normally recommend 15 mils. So I'm going to say do 15 mil pours, save the rest for later, whether that's as soon as we finish or tomorrow, that's up to you. But also be aware that we're going to get into some pretty high ABVs as well tonight. So it's going to be a lot of fun. As always, and for the second night in a row, I'd like to welcome Brand Ambassador for the Exchange, Cam Pirret, and Sales Rep Michael Thomas to the live stream here at the Oak Barrel to talk us through tonight. So, lads, welcome.
Thanks, mate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott.
Guys, on behalf of myself and Mike and the Exchange, a massive thank you for having us along. Thanks to Scott and the guys from the Oak Barrel, and for all those joining us, thank you to you. Obviously, very different to the way we're used to doing things, but really good that people are still engaging, getting involved, and we can still do these tastings. I know it keeps us sane, and it's a lot of fun for us, and I hope you guys enjoy it at home. And for those who aren't joining us live but watching it back, please enjoy. So, guys, tonight what we're going to talk about is, of course, bourbon, and what we're going to do is we're going to drill down and look into a little bit about the history of it, how it differentiates from other whiskeys around the world, and then we're going to look at some of the amazing small batch range from Jim Beam, which is obviously like the biggest bourbon distillery in the United States. So the thing about booze history is a lot of it has been looked after or stewarded by people who themselves drank a lot of booze. So it's always muddled and a little bit conflicted. And I'm just going to give you sort of the rough rundown of where we're looking at for the history of bourbon production. Essentially, what you had is in about the 18th century, the 1700s, you had a lot of people immigrating to the US, particularly from Scotland, Ireland, and Germany. And these guys brought a knowledge of distillation with them. Now, at the time, the government was giving vast patches of land out in the middle of the US for free, as long as the people would cultivate and farm the land, so to get like a rich agricultural sector going. What grew well in the land at the time was obviously grain, things like wheat, rye, barley, maize, and then the big one, corn as well. So the guys were out there cultivating the land, being farmers, and obviously they would take their grain from the season and sell that on for people to make bread and feed their families and the like. The problem with that is when you have a good year or a really good harvest, you have to then store that excess grain. And that's actually quite a difficult task. It requires large silos to store it in. Grain is susceptible to pests, disease. It's harder to transport and it's harder to sell excess grain. People generally have a good idea of what they want. So what a much better solution was to take their small stills that they had in their farms, their moonshine setups, and make new make spirit that was quite higher proof, 60, 70%, and then store that. Now, that's not going to go off, not going to get attacked by pest or disease. It's easier to transport and easier to sell a bit of excess whiskey rather than sell grain. So they used to put these on boats and send it down the Mississippi and different rivers to these town hubs. And at the same time, what they were also doing is to store their fish and their meat and their different produce that was salted and smoked. They used to use charred barrels as well. So they were putting the whiskey into these charred barrels to transport it. And people noticed that the flavor and color of this moonshine was so much more delicious and better. And that's sort of the history of how bourbon starts to take shape in the US, where these people who are coming from places that already had distillation, like Scotland and Ireland and Eastern Europe, and just sort of making it their own with the grains they had around. And again, it was the grains that they were growing that they were using to make this whiskey, hence the corn and the rye. Now, essentially what happened is throughout time, sort of more towards the turn of the 18th century, and with Jim Beam, we started in 1795, the more prominent of these farmers who were distilling was saying, all right, you know what, we're going to really focus on the distillation aspect. So what we're going to do is we're going to drill down into focusing on the distillation, the aging, and the selling of the spirit, and we'll buy in from the local farmers around us and really focus on being the distiller rather than the whole process farmer. The thing about that is as soon as you kick that distillation up, the first thing you need outside of those grains in the still that you use in massive, massive quantities is water. So now you have to pick a farming site, not so much based on water for irrigation and farming, but you have to pick a site based on water for distilling, which is so much more. You also need transport to transport grains in and to transport grains out. So your bigger houses like Jim Beam, the sites they're on now, you'll find they generally have readily available access to large quantities of water. They also have usually really good rail networks somewhere along the line for transporting things. So that's kind of the history of these bigger houses setting up to be bourbon producers. If we go forward all the way to 1964, bourbon had been evolving and changing for all these years. And it was in 1964 that they laid down the 8 laws of bourbon. Now, essentially, bourbon is one of the most controlled spirits in the world in terms of what it has to be and the laws that you have to follow. That's a good thing because it makes it simple for us in terms of we know exactly what we're talking about when we talk about a bourbon. The important ones we're going to focus on tonight, bourbon has to be a minimum of 51% corn. That's where you get that beautiful bourbon sweetness and chewiness from, that mouthfeel. That corn gives you not massive amounts of flavor per se, but that lovely palate weight and that sweetness. The second one has to be made in the United States of America. Doesn't have to be made in Kentucky, although that's where a lot of the good stuff comes from, but there's bourbons coming out of all over America, particularly in like the Northeast and West, out of New York State, and out of like Washington and stuff like that. There's plenty of bourbons up in those regions as well. Has to be aged in brand new charred oak. Now, this was put in by the Timber Association, who lobby the government, keeps the timber industry really, really strong. There's plenty of American white oak there, and it's really cheap, easy to use, great for barrel production. However, that law that's put in there does not say it has to be that American white oak. You could put a bourbon in a brand new Spanish oak barrel or French oak if you wanted to. No one does. It's so much more expensive, and those woods are actually quite harsh if they haven't had a bit of seasoning first, and it has to be brand new oak. So for the purpose of keeping it simple, all your bourbon pretty much goes in brand new charred American white oak. The good thing about that is when we char that white oak, we get some nice consistent flavors that we can kind of rely on. So when we're talking about flavors of bourbon and the wood influence on that, things like vanilla in terms of spice, things like caramel and butterscotch come through in terms of sweetness. In terms of the fruit, whenever we talk about fruit notes in bourbon, we always lead with tropical fruits, things like pineapple, banana, coconut, melons, and then maybe a hint of stone fruit coming through in some of our older ones as well. So it does give us nice, reliable characteristics. And then age. So this is a bit of a tricky one that's argued around. For simple things, think bourbon has to be a minimum of 2 years old. It's not actually quite true. Bourbon has to tell you how old it is unless it's 2 years old. So once we get to 2 years old, we can call it a straight bourbon. We can call it bourbon if it's younger than 2 years old, but we have to put that on the bottle. So if you pick up a bottle of bourbon and it's only been aged for a year and a half, it's still a bourbon, but it has to say that age on it. Once they get to 2 years old, there's no ruling that says they have to put that age statement on the bottle. So again, to simplify, for the purpose of bourbon, we just say it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years. There's not many out there you'll find that are going less than that and putting the age on there. It's really much the norm for bourbons to be aged at least 2 years. What we're going to look at tonight with Jim Beam is Kentucky straight bourbon. And so to think a bit more about that, a few more rules that we'll discuss, some particular to Kentucky, it has to be aged for 4 years and they don't age anything after the distillation process. And that makes it a Kentucky straight bourbon, and obviously coming from Kentucky. There are a few more rules around the distillation and ABV, which we won't get into. But essentially, bourbon is not as distilled as high as a lot of spirits because they want to keep that big bourbon flavor there. And it's not as barreled as high ABV as a lot of spirits because in Kentucky, barrels can actually go up in ABV, which we'll talk about when we talk about aging. But that's pretty much all the rules of bourbon. So it is really, really controlled. But before we get in, just to recap, guys, what we're looking at tonight is stuff that's made in Kentucky. It's a minimum of 4 years old. It's all been aged in brand new charred oak, and it's all a minimum of 51% corn. So that's what we're looking at tonight, guys. And this is the order we're going to do. So we're going to start with our Basil Hayden. Then we're going to do our Bakers, then our Bookers, and then our Knob Creek small batch. So just with that, guys, if you have got the beautiful Stillhouse pack with you, it is in a little bit of a different order to the way it's packed. So that's the order we're going to do it in tonight. For those, while I talk about the way we make bourbon, who are getting a little bit thirsty, I completely understand. So if you want to pour yourself a little bit of Basil before we come to explaining exactly what this whiskey is, by all means. So guys, essentially when it comes to making bourbon, what we have is a recipe or a mash bill. We take the different grains we're going to use and we cook and crush them together. So as I said, it has to be a minimum of corn. We always use malted barley. The reason for this is malted barley has an enzyme in it that is really important for fermentation. Yeast and barley go hand in hand when we're fermenting. So really important we use a little bit of malted barley for that lovely round flavor and to kick off that fermentation. Have to have the corn there. And then we always use a third grain. Now that third grain can change. People can use more, 4 grain, 5 grain if they want, but generally they use 3. And the most commonly used third grain is rye. Now what's rye like as a grain? It's much more spicy and herbaceous on the finish. Gives you more of that punchy finish rather than that big sweet Kentucky chew, and can be quite floral on the nose. It's a very complex grain. So when we look at Jim Beam Distillery, generally we use about 75% corn, 15% rye, and 10% malted barley. And that is a pretty traditional Kentucky blend. If you look to the other big whiskey houses, things like Wild Turkey, Buffalo Trace as examples, you'll find they're pretty similar. There's not a massive variation sort of between that level of how they're doing their grains. As I said, up to the distilleries, the recipes they want to use, but that's a fairly consistent Kentucky low rye blend that you'll find in most of your bigger Kentucky bourbon houses. So with that, guys, we take it, crush, cook, ferment like we do with all whiskeys. And then bourbon itself is double distilled, but we use 2 types of distillation. So we use a column still first, and then a doubler or a short fat pot still second. Column does the hard work for us. Column takes us from about 10% alcohol up to about 55% alcohol. And then the pot still does that finesse work and takes us from about 55% alcohol up to about 62 to 67% alcohol, depending on your distillery. A good way to think about it, if you like, is if you just bought a whole animal, like a pig or a sheep, and you're a butcher, the cleaver that you use to cut the sections up is the column still. It does all that sort of rough work to get us sort of the shape we want. And then your nice trimming knife that comes and puts all the finesse and edge and subtlety into that spirit. That's our pot still. It does all the nice rounding out of that liquid. We then take that spirit at no more than 62.5% alcohol, and we put it into barrel, and there we age. Now, the aging process in Kentucky, happens in very, very large rack houses. They're 3 barrels, 200-litre barrels to a story, 9 stories high. So you can imagine 27 barrels high, about 50 barrels deep, 25 barrels wide, massive rack houses. And what this means is in the Kentucky summer, with the sun hitting one side as it rises and one side as it sets, the temperature fluctuation all over that warehouse is massively different. Now, temperature impacts how we age that whiskey. So you get different flavors from different barrels all over the warehouse. And then the last part of the process, guys, when we blend it all together, is which barrels did we choose? How long was the whiskey in those barrels? And then finally, the filtration. So a lot of your bourbons are chill filtered. That's because there is a fair bit of tannin associated with the aging process of bourbon from that barrel. And the chill filtration just softens out some of those heavier notes and some of that texture. We basically chill the spirit down before we filter it, and it just takes some of those bigger particles out. And they're the ones that have some of those more robust and intense notes, which leads me perfectly into our first whiskey tonight, guys, the Basil Hayden. So Basil Hayden was, it's a bit of a tip of the hat to one of our first producers in Kentucky. So he was a farmer and a bit of a preacher or a clergyman, but also one of the first sort of proper distillers who was doing more of the distillation than he was focusing on the farming. You can see the bottle shape there. That's sort of the parchment and the belt that the guys used to wear in the farm. And the beautiful thing about having a preacher sort of make and store the whiskey is, like in all life, there's 2 things that are certain: it's death and taxes. But the one place that still is exempt from tax is the church. So if your clergyman's making the whiskey, it's not a bad thing. So this is a Basil Hayden. It's quite unique. In this one, it's still a bourbon, but we double the rye content. So you've actually got 30% rye in here with 10% malted barley and corn. So it's got a little bit more of that rye punch that we expect. As I said, with filtration, generally speaking, most of our small batch or premium bourbons aren't filtered because we know that you guys like to have all that flavor and that extra hit. But with the Basil Hayden, it is still chill filtered. So it's quite a soft small batch bourbon, 40% alcohol. And this one's not an age statement, but when it was sort of in that 8-year sort of mark. So guys, let's have a drink. I'm probably pretty sure by now I'm the only one who hasn't started yet, so I'm going to catch up. But
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And there's some questions coming through, and I am logging the questions to ask Cam in a second, so keep them coming through across the platforms. And just a heads up, the order we're doing tonight is not in rarity or price or anything like that. It's starting at the lighter end of the spectrum and getting into the bigger end of the spectrum. So taking on a bit of a journey, which is something like I've always thought, even though it has that dryness and that like hint of spice at the end on the Basil Hayden, it is a really soft, sort of gentle walk into bourbon, whether it's your first bourbon ever or your first bourbon of the night. It's a really good starting point.
Yeah, for me, guys, flavor profile, you should be able to pick up like a bit of orange peel, a little bit of star anise or that licorice note that you can sometimes find in a rye. There's herbaceousness there, maybe like thyme, bit of honey, and then you start to get some of those vanillas and a little bit of that chewy spice at the end from the oak. But it is a very clean, light bourbon to start us off with. And as I said, very unique, because for a small batch bourbon to be filtered, to have that higher rye content, it really sits in a sort of a league of its own to most small batch bourbons. As I said, it's not a low rye build like we're used to from Kentucky bourbons. It's not a full rye whiskey. It sits right in that middle zone. Absolutely beautiful. And the first of our small batch series tonight.
So Cam, just a quick one. Just in regards to its age, we actually have gone back to an 8-year-old. So the new bottlings that are coming through actually are going back to having the age statement put onto it. The other question that I have, Cam, whereabouts in the barrel house? So we talk about 3 barrels high, 9 stories high. Whereabouts would this actually come from in a particular barrel house? Do they turn and put the rye bourbons to a specific one at Beam?
So good question. A little guarded. So my understanding is that the Basil Hayden essentially almost gets its own section of the rack houses, being of it's like the only one of that recipe that we do at Beam. So if we talk about the classic recipe in the rack house, they would just fill a whole rack house with classic recipe, and all the other stuff goes to making all the different small batches. All the rye kind of goes into one warehouse, and then the Basil Hayden would have a certain section in the warehouse that they probably fill up. As to what section that is, I don't know, but it would be fairly consistent across wherever they put it in the warehouses. So when we start talking about the other sections, of the warehouse that he used for specific bourbons, I'd say Basil Hayden would just kind of sit outside of that. Predominantly, I would say probably in a rye warehouse somewhere. But for the exact location of Basil Hayden, we don't know. We're not told exactly where it sits in the warehouse.
I think one thing that'd be good to point out for people who, maybe, sort of dipping their toes in bourbon for the first time, or at least dipping their toes in a serious bourbon for the first time, the 4 whiskies we're going to try essentially come from the same company, the same place. They're going into warehouses owned by the same, but they are completely different end products. And I know last night when we were talking about peated whiskey, we were talking about the concept of terroir in peat as being a big part of whiskey, where it comes from the ground. Obviously, with wine, it's a huge part of, the end flavour. But I think with bourbon, it's almost like a cultural terroir. We did this way because of this, and this is the way we're always going to do it for this particular brand. I think as you'll see, like all these whiskies tonight, or at least 3 of them are named after people and individuals and families. And, it's Jim Beam, that's a name. These are stories passed down and sort of techniques passed down from generation to generation, which is why we drink the sort of bourbons we have today. So I think like there is a real cultural, storytelling involved with all bourbon.
Yeah, so I mean, if there's any other questions, I'll take them now before we go through to the next. Otherwise, we might talk a little bit about how we ended up at Small Batch with the Jim Beam family.
One question, because we are drinking a 40% whiskey to start off with. We are going to get bigger and further. Bart Bink's comments on the Zoom chat, just in terms of dropping water to bring out flavour. And we are going to get into that.
I got a bottle of water.
Yeah, so I think we might be addressing that in the future as we get into a couple of whiskies. A big g'day to Alex Darlenberg, who says g'day, but also Mauro asks on the Facebook, does Jim Beam have humid and dry cellars? Does that come into different things, or is it more within a cellar or a rick house rather?
Nah, they just have the one type of rick house, but you just find the humidity is obviously way different at the top and the bottom. So
yeah, okay. So you manage that within a rick house rather than separately.
Yeah, exactly, 100%.
Yeah, cool.
So guys, I mean, I guess we're probably starting to look at the maturation process a bit more in depth. So we'll go forward and I'll touch on sort of how the whole process works, and hopefully that answers a few questions. So essentially, it was actually the 4th generation of the Beam family that was James or Jim Beam. The reason it's now his namesake on the whiskey, or the reason he sort of is the champion of the Beam family, is because he had to look after the distillery during Prohibition. So a bit of a stitch up if your old man gives you a distillery and then you can't make and sell the products. So for his stewardship during that difficult time of Prohibition, that's why we call it Jim Beam. But it was actually then his son, Jeremiah, he didn't have any kids of his own. He only had daughters, and it was his daughter who married Booker No, and that's where the No legacy of distillers comes in. Now, at the time, in the 70s and 80s, Scotch whiskey and single malt was starting to really burst onto the American scene, and particularly in the younger drinkers, it was just seen as so much cooler at the time. There was age statements coming out, different class finishings, like different releases, like 4 releases from a distillery, like Macallan hitting the scene, and all these whiskeys making a big peated whiskey coming out. So the old boys in Kentucky were sort of fighting the trend to try and do new and cool releases, and a bit like, that's not what Kentucky whiskey is. We make our family recipe, we make it well, we don't do a lot of variation around it. And so in 1974, a man by the name of Elmer T. Lee, who now was working at a distillery that is now Buffalo Trace, he released the first ever single barrel, which was Blanton's single barrel. Really cool, really popular, and sort of started that push for like, where can Kentucky whiskey go? Where can it break out of the mold of what it has been for 100 years? So then in the 80s or 82, 80, Booker No started being, well, I'm not going to do single barrel. I want to think about small batching. And so he started to look at what he had in his rack houses. And obviously, like, if you want to keep consistent whiskey in these big different temperatured rack houses with the intense aging happening in the heat up the top, and the softer, slower aging happening in the middle and down the bottom, you have to keep rotating those barrels. But if I don't rotate these barrels, I get this amazing palette of different flavors on the same wood, on the same alcohol, aged at the same time. And I really get this rich tapestry of different flavors that I can put together however I like. Now, the thing about bourbon aging, and the reason I said before that they only put it in the barrel at a maximum of 62.5% is because of the humidity and the condition of Kentucky. because it can be so dry in that intense aging climate, even though you're losing volume in your barrel, so the volume of the liquid is going down over time, what you're actually losing is the water content out of that liquid in the barrel and not the alcohol content. So by that I mean, and I've tried them, you can be in Kentucky and have barrels from like the top of the rack house that have been there for 9-10 years, and it's actually, the alcohol's gone up from 62.5% to now might be sitting at like 85% alcohol. For this reason, this is just a little bit of a side note, they're probably some of the most explosive warehouses in the world. We recently lost one to a fire at Jim Beam. Don't worry, we have a lot of warehouses, it's no bigs, but
4.2 million litres.
Yeah, a little bit of alcohol was lost. But yeah, so because of that reason, bourbon distilleries will only hold on to a maximum of 75% of their own holdings. We have 3 sets of 10% at other distilleries that we get for free because we do the same thing for those distilleries. And most distilleries will keep about 30% of the holdings with someone else. Back in the 60s, 70s, there was a really, really bad distillery fire at what is Heaven's Hill. Took out like 70% of their holdings. Everyone in Kentucky shut down production for one day and sent people to go help them so that they could get back on their feet because they just never would have been able to otherwise. And since that day, distilleries have yeast at 3 other distilleries. They have barrels at 3 other distilleries. So it's a great community spirit, but it is because of the volatility of aging in these massive rick houses and because of the fluctuation you get from these low barrels that are lower in ABV and then these high barrels higher in ABV. So the aging process happening in these rick houses is really, really complex. If we jump across and look at Scotland, where it's 2, maybe 3-story dunnages, low, cold, the aim is to keep it the same temperature year round, about that like 2 to 4 degrees if they can, like, you know, that real cold, slow aging. That's why they get 21-year-old, 25-year-old, 30-year-old whiskeys. The sweet spot for bourbon is probably like 8 to 12, even for your most premium bourbons. I mean, I think most of the juice tastes good at about 6 years. So it's a very different aging environment, but it does yield the opportunity to make small batch bourbon. And actually the first of our small batch bourbons was the one we're going to come to next was Booker. As I said, he was the first one to take over outside of the Beam name. And he was the first one to do his own small batch. The one we're going to look at next is actually Baker's, and Baker was his brother, and his brother's a bit like, well, I know I'm not like the namesake and the steward of the distillery at the moment, but I still want to do my small batch. So if we look at a rack house, and if you can kind of imagine this being our rack house, and we've got all our barrels lined up, and that's obviously like about 27 barrels high, 50 barrels wide. He's taken a nice line of barrels right sort of down the middle. So right near the middle of the warehouse, he's gone from top to bottom and taken a line of his favorite barrels. And that was his favorite line. The reason for that line being different flavor is, again, because of where the sun rises and sets. So the sun obviously a bit softer in the morning in some parts and a bit hotter in the afternoon at different times of the year. So he's picked that line. 7 years old, 53.5% for the Bakers. And because of the row he's chosen, what you'll find when you try this whiskey is it has a lovely, because we've got some of those barrels from right up the top in the middle, it's got sort of more spice to it, more nut, and some more like direct vanilla flavor, and a bit more of that sort of bright and chewy caramel.
So, Cam, with this one here, would you start to think about adding ice, adding a little bit of water to it, or what's your preference?
So with this, guys, if you like adding ice to your whiskey, that's totally fine. It will, in all honesty, sort of detract from the flavor a little bit. Ice just makes it colder, tightens the whiskey up a bit. If you've got some just off room temperature water, a splash of that will open it up, bring it down in ABV a bit and open it up for you. You will just lose a little bit of that sort of chewiness of back palate. But for me, I find when it comes to drinking whiskey, the number one rule is to do it however you like. As long as you've got a smile on your dial, you're doing it right. If anyone tries to tell you otherwise, tell them to beat it. But when you're tasting whiskey, you should definitely try it first on its own. Then if you think it's a bit strong, just add a splash of water and just get it to where you want. Then once you know how you like that whiskey, then by all means, add ice, add a splash of water, go nuts. But you sort of want to build into it. As I said, you've got a good sample of all these here. So even if you just pour like your first sort of 5 or 10 mil and see if you like it with water or ice or how you like it, then you know what you can do with the rest of it. Yeah, I mean, it is very much a personal preference thing. I would say adding water is a little bit like decanting a wine. You can't undecant it. You can't go back and be like, oh, it really didn't need all that aeration. So it's the same thing. Once you add the water, you can't take it out. So just build up to where you want it.
A couple of questions while we'll let Cam have a mouthful there. Quick g'day to Ivan and Gerald on the Facebook there. A couple of questions coming in. What's the difference between a rick house and a rack house? Absolutely nothing.
Correct.
So it's actually a funny thing because we used to run a lot of tastings here at the Oak Barrel out the back. A lot of countries will use just different terminology to say the same thing. So I actually make it a habit when I'm setting up the room for, say, a bourbon tasting, just chuck an American whiskey podcast on so I can remember how they say rick house instead of warehouse. The only warehouse that I really know of that would be a little bit different would be a dunnage warehouse, which is sort of a lower down, only 3 levels high, but otherwise rick house, rack house, warehouse, all the same thing. Another question about alcohol evaporation and why, if alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than water, do we get water coming out of the cask first and alcohol volume coming up? And it's really, and I'm not a scientist on this, but it's about the air pressure and that sort of thing, different climates. Places like America and in certain parts of Australia, we see water getting sucked out of the cask quicker. Places like Scotland and Japan, you see alcohol getting sucked out of the cask quicker. So yeah, it's very much a... it's just sort of about the, it's essentially about the humidity. So if you've got a really high humidity up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and if we look across into another spirit and think about rum and the places it's made, all through South America, think about tequila and those places where it's super, super humid. Now, it's because of the water content of the liquid in the barrel is a lot lower than the water content of the air, the humid air in those climates. So what's getting sucked out is the alcohol. The alcohol is going to try and balance that. So when we look at Kentucky and it's super, super dry, there's a lot more moisture in the air in that barrel than there is outside. And that wood is almost like it's an osmotic membrane. So like the water's trying to move from high concentration to low concentration. So the condition in your barrel has heaps of water in that atmosphere, and the condition outside in the rick house is quite dry. So the water is coming out of the barrel quicker than the alcohol is, because it's just the water's trying to escape to that drier climate. And that's why when you look at the poor guys in Taiwan making like Kavalan and stuff, they're losing not just a large volume of the alcohol in that barrel, but they're losing a massive quantity of ABV as well. So at least with the bourbon guys, they never really have to worry too much about if they've aged it so long, will it still be at proof? Well, generally, yeah. There's not many instances of like it coming back down too far. So it's pretty safe. I mean, the problem side with that is it's hard to age a bourbon for too long because then you end up with this super potent alcohol that's just got so much wood flavor. And something they struggle with in Kentucky is younger drinkers wanting to drink a 20-year-old bourbon. But the truth of the matter is they might age it for 20 years, but they filter all the flavor that happened in the last 10 years out. So you're just kind of paying for 10 years of filtration. But it's tough because, as I said, the sweet spot is really at that sort of 8 to 10 year mark, just because of how intense that aging is and how much, because that alcohol is concentrating in ABV, it's concentrating flavor. So you've got some really intense flavors, and one of those flavors can be a lot of that tannin and resin that comes from the wood. Not bad juice, this Baker's stuff. I have to admit, it's been a long time since I've had a Baker's. It's one of the those good problems of having the greatest job in the world of trying new exciting whiskies every day. You never really double back too often on things that are available. So it's been like pretty much everything else I've had in the past sort of 12, 18 months, but I reckon it's good 2 or 3 years since I've had a Baker's.
Yeah, I mean, for guys as well who are thinking they like theirs on ice, by all means throw on a bit of ice, but if that's the way you drink your whiskey, don't be afraid to put these guys in an old-fashioned. They all make like wicked old-fashions. If you can get your hands on a bit of bitters and a spoonful of sugar and a twist of orange, like it's not impossible just to throw a spoonful of sugar and bitters in there and some booze and mix it around and put your ice on it with a twist of orange. And particularly for me, of all of these, the Baker's is like, it lends itself to that extra splash of bitters and sweetness with that extra spice from the intense aging of some of those higher barrels. Like it's a really amazing old-fashioned bourbon.
I think one of the things we find with a lot of brand ambassadors for a lot of brands around the world, they've come from the bartending scene a lot of the time, so they have that really, deep, intense cocktail knowledge. And I, never worked behind a bar because I figured out pretty early that the other side was the correct side to be on. And so I went through a long period of making really terrible old fashions for myself because it just tasted like watered down whiskey. And I figured out it's pretty simple in the end. Use whiskies that are over 100 proof by the American mark. So like get over that 50%, just get that whiskey, that guts through. And then they turn into quite nice things. But it did take a couple of bartenders to teach me that I was doing it wrong before I figured that very simple equation out.
Yeah, rye is like a bartender's best friend for making cocktails. Like bartenders love mixing with rye as I would say of all the dark spirits, probably my favorite to mix with. But yeah, the problem is sometimes you're a bit like, oh, I swear it tasted really good last time I made it. Then you look down and like you're using 50% one time and then you're using 40 the next. So, I mean, American whiskey, we're in Australia, so we see 40 written on a lot of bottles, but American whiskey loves being around 50, 55%. It's like the sweet spot.
Yeah. I think, it's sort of, my favorite bourbons, whether they're 2 years old or 20 years old, always have a bit of heat and guts to them, that for me. And it's actually, going back to what you were saying at the very start, where I've seen in that sort of post-prohibition, post-1960s world, where bourbon has, really started to take hold again and start to challenge some of the bigger, whiskey producing countries, is when they've gone for those bolder flavors, not just in ABV, but in pure flavors, and gone, no, this is what whiskey was. We're not sort of pandering to the lower end, keep it soft and subtle and, mixable. It's no, this is big and beautiful and it's American and we like big trucks and big steaks and that sort of thing.
Everything's big. Everything bigger is better. So that leads nicely into like the book is it's got a massive cult following. It's most people's favorite, and I can't argue. But again, it's just big. So the book is done in a different batch release most years. It's quite a small batch of our small batch bourbons. The one you're trying tonight is 63%, and I believe about 6 years and 3 months old. And in that warehouse, it's actually just a small section sort of down to the bottom right of the warehouse, about 4 barrels taken from a lower portion more to the outside. So it does get a bit more of that morning and afternoon sun from being closer to the edge of the warehouse. But because it's not right up the top with that intensely a dry condition, the aging is a lot softer. You'll find that it's more the fruit, like the stewed banana, and the chewiness is of the caramel. It's a lot more soft. The spice in the oak is less driven, and it's not quite as dry. And it does have a big finish in that heat when you breathe out. But if you give it the old Kentucky swirl and send it around the mouth a few times and over the gums and chops before you swallow it, you'll notice that the long-lasting sort of fruit that you keep in the palate is really amazing. This one, guys, as I said, being 63%, this is where if you're not a bit of a feral like me and drink heaps of cask strength whiskey all the time, I would absolutely advocate a splash of water. So,
is this the same mash bill as the Bakers?
This is the same mash bill as the Bakers. So it's still that classic Jim Beam mash bill of 15 rye, 75 corn, and 10% malted barley, which is the same for all 3 of the last whiskies we tried. It's only the Basil Hayden that had that doubling of the rye there.
See, and I love that. To make exactly the same mash bill in, the same Willy Wonka booze factory, and be able to, strategically place them in different warehouses in different spots at different levels and get 3 completely different bourbons.
It's all the same juice coming out of Claremont, Kentucky, and it goes in the same barrels, and it's just the time and the location of the warehouse. And that's the impressive thing about it. It literally is the exact same juice. Like sometimes people refuse to believe that what ends up in the humble bottle of Jim Beam White is the same stuff that 2.5 years later can be a Booker's in the same wood and same liquid. But that's the beauty of Kentucky and the way they age their whiskey. It's truly phenomenal.
Yeah. So Scott, one of the things we were talking about before in regards to availability, especially with Bookers. So Australia's on once a year allocation, unfortunately. There's just not enough made. Or
we lost Mike. Yeah. But basically what Mike was about to say there is that we get sweet FA of this once a year. I think last year we sold out in about 4 days. It was basically within a week from way to go. which was actually when I jumped on the blower and said, what small format whiskies have we got in the country? And it's like, we got the bourbon pack. It's like, yeah, what's in that again? It's like, oh yeah, Basil and Baker's. Oh, there's Booker's in there as well. I was like, what? We meant to sell this for $50. So unfortunately, we can't sell you this one tonight. If you like it, it's not on the price sheet that I've sent around. But so this is one to savor.
On that, guys, when the Booker's of the small batch comes out, with the other three we tried tonight, when we do releases, we try and keep them pretty much as best we can, same every year. Like, we try and for consistency with those products. The Booker's is not that. Like, they put the batch number, it'll be different ages some years, different ABVs every year. And if you're a bit of a Booker's nerd, and I know they're out there, people will literally keep a few different years of Booker's back to back to try the difference in them. So, like, they are different whiskies. And if you do enjoy your Booker's, if you've got one and you see a different release come out next year, it'll taste different 100%. Like, the difference will be subtle unless you line them up next to each other, but it's definitely a batch whiskey that we make to be different every time we batch it. So,
and at the risk of yeah, that's all right. At the risk of throwing myself under the bus, basically, Mike, we just said it's rare. Buy it when you see it. Can't sell it to you tonight. At the risk of throwing myself and the Oak Barrel's pricing schemes under the bus, at least last year it was very, very cost effective for a whiskey and a bourbon that is highly sought after, that you see once a year, when these things can go a little bit crazy sometimes in terms of price. So,
if you think of the madness of what we pay for Yamazaki 12, which is just like insane, to then you think of like the quality of spirit that a Booker's is, the ABV of it, and the rarity of it. I mean, we get Yamazaki about 4 times a year. We get Booker's once, twice if we're lucky. So, I mean, for bang for buck, if you like your American, like, it's awesome.
We're talking about the 120, 130 mark off the top of my head on the shelf.
Yeah, I think it's about that. Yeah.
Are we expecting an allocation this year, or did I miss it? You don't love me anymore.
It wasn't on plan for 4th of July. So hopefully it's still on its way. I'll probably get a text message from Louise very shortly going no or yes. So hopefully she's listening and still watching.
Yeah. Chad from WA reckons Booker's June or July. And Chris Ray, back to 2 nights in a row. Excellent to see. Lucky enough to get a bottle last year. Now I know how lucky he was. Yeah, definitely. And it's September.
So Canvas, a quick one, just in regards to the ones that Fred did around Little Book. What's the main difference between the chapters and Little Book versus Booker?
Okay, so the beauty of live TV. Give me 2 seconds.
Talk amongst yourself. This is
I'm ready, don't worry.
Yeah.
So this is what Mike's referring to. This little number here. I had to go to Kentucky to pick it up. So, but basically, so Fred Noah is our current, obviously, master distiller, but his son Freddie is looking to take the reins a little. So this is his first blending of some of the stuff he's thrown down. Now the Little Book is a bit of an enigma. So it's blended straight whiskey, and what we mean is they haven't got the 51% rye we need for it to be a rye whiskey. We haven't got the 51% corn we need for it to be a corn whiskey. It's kind of just a bit of a marriage of all three. Barley, rye, and corn. The proportion of that, I do not know. I will never find out. I guarantee that. The age, I'm not entirely sure either. It was all fairly secret, released in 2017 as just a little taster into some of the stuff they're doing in the future. It is absolutely delicious, but this is again just showing you kind of where things will be heading, I guess. But if you do keep an eye, if you see it, good luck to you. But if you keep an eye out, there's some cool releases coming out of the distillery. But this is a Little Book, which is kind of the future of, I guess, where small batch is going when Freddie gets to take the reins. So
my one's not as big as your boy's one. That's a little bit sad, but that's all right. I want to sort of just follow up something I said earlier in that, like, this is, for me, this is what, American whiskey is and what bourbon can be at its sort of peak without it necessarily being, $1,000 a bottle type thing. And I think it's these sort of whiskeys that are so true and authentically bourbon that are sort of pulling bourbon back to where it should be, in not just in American whiskey consumption, but globally. We spoke a little bit about Irish whiskey last year. And if you look at sort of the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, America and Ireland managed to shoot themselves in the foot and sort of wipe out their production. And then when you sort of finish Prohibition, you don't just go back again. You've got all this time you need to redistill to get stuff to come back up. So if the world had been a little bit different, Scotch could have been the underdog, and bourbon, everyone around the world could have been drinking American whiskey. And I think that's starting to claw back, and it's these sort of whiskies that I think are going to be right at the forefront of that fight.
Massively so. And Australia is per capita one of the biggest bourbon markets in the world. I think it's actually the biggest outside of the US at the moment, if the numbers I saw last are still holding. So, I mean, we're massively big for it here in Australia. I mean, on that note, when it comes to why drink bourbon, I think there's such a fallacy out there that like Scotch goes with cheese and meat and Scotch goes with chalky and you got to drink sherried Scotches to have like pairings. And that is complete and utter poppycock. We did we've been doing Boilermakers recently and we did Boilermakers from around the world. But today we're looking at Boilermakers with American whiskey and works beautifully, like big flavored, like Booker's goes great with things that have like extra sweetness to them, like porters or stouts or barrel fermented beers. Things like the Basil Hayden with that light sweetness go great with like your sour style beers or your real tropical and fruity style beers. With your darker ales, like something like a Knob Creek that's really rounded, like you can definitely do Boilermakers. They work amazing with chalky. I've still got some Easter egg left over that these will definitely be getting paired to. And then also because of that big finish from that ABV and that chewy sweetness, you don't have to worry about having like a creamy cheese, like a blue or a brie, and just having that coat your mouth so you can't get the flavor where you do with sort of a delicate Scotch. Like the robustness of these whiskeys means they pair beautifully with food and Boilermakers as well. So sometimes there's a bit of a misnomer out there that bourbon, you've got to drink like bourbon straight or old fashioned or with Coke, but it pairs so beautifully with food. And if you look at American food and the size of the flavors that get paired alongside whiskey, I mean, it's just beautiful for drinking food, for having food with it. So
can confirm also goes well in a Pinot Noir Boilermaker. That's side by side.
Yeah, I was wondering what was in that mug.
Yeah. Pinot Noir and whiskey. God love it. And then on the side, a shot of Fernet Branca as well, just to wash things down. And I think the bakers would go best with the Fernet Branca in this case. The Bannets.
Scott, you have a problem.
When the bars open back up, I'm going straight for the Bannets.
So guys, we'll look at our last whiskey, but I just want to indulge myself just slightly. So we essentially make three types of recipe or mash build at Jim Beam. So we talked about the classic low rye with the 15% rye. Our first one was a high rye with the Basil Hayden and that 30%. And then we have our rye whiskies. Now, our rye blend is actually quite low on the rye side. We're 55% rye, 10% barley, then 35% corn. So as you can see, when you think about rye whiskey, that's actually quite a low proportion of rye. I think there's some out there, and don't quote me, but I think Bullet sits much up around more that like 95% mark somewhere. And I know that like generally a lot of ryes are more at that like 65 and above. So I like the fact that we don't have that much rye in it. It means we're still getting that rye punch, but we're not subtracting away from that chewiness and mouthfeel and that bourbon feel. Sort of like having our cake and eating it too a little bit. And for that reason, I brought that up because we're going to look at Knob Creek. And Knob Creek, in both the rye and the Knob Creek, the way we take that is it's a section in the warehouse. It's basically a giant X right through the middle. So we get the center barrels, the outside, the bottom, the top. It's just a beautiful combination of all the most poignant flavors. It's like taking the sharpest flavors we have all over the rick house and then sort of putting them together to make this really big, bold whiskey. The rye is actually one of our most highly awarded whiskeys of all time. If you like your rye, you've definitely got to check out the Knob Creek rye. And even the Knob Creek is beautiful. So I think potentially my favorite of the bourbons, we're trying the 9-year-old small batch tonight, which is 50% or 100 proof. There's also a single barrel at 60. Very similar whiskeys, a single barrel, a bit more cleaner flavor and coming from more the sort of central part of the rack house. But yeah, absolutely beautiful, guys. So Knob Creek is a little bit of a tip of a cap to Abe Lincoln. The farm he grew up on in Kentucky had like a river running down the back that was known as Knob Creek. Now, in America, knob does not mean the same things it does in Australia and England. Had they known that?
What does it mean in Australia and England?
I don't know. I'm not sure. But yeah, but you'll see as well, they've done a bit of a throwback to the Prohibition style bottle, and the label actually resembles like the newspaper that you would use to hide your bottle that you got from the grog shop during Prohibition on the way home to sneak your booze around the street. So very much a Prohibition style bottle. And one of the reasons at the tip of the cap to Lincoln is Kentucky is actually a really interesting state. Definitely not a Civil War buff, but it's one of the states that was rarely kind of split in half in the way it went during the Civil War between the Confederate and the Union. There's still statues of like both generals from both sides there. You can have literally in the same street, 2 different museums from different sides of the Civil War. They're one that's sort of like amalgamation of both. So a really interesting place to see that sort of history come to life. And obviously, a lot of the distilleries already had slaves, but not slaves, but paid workers. And one of the big things was about getting the tax dollar out of these workers who were already getting paid as illegal workers. So, but it also freed the distillery up to hire more people and pay them more freely. So a bit of a tip of the cap to him. And just, yeah, an absolutely beautiful, beautiful whiskey. So one of our newer in the small batch range.
Immediately, I'm getting a lot more caramels and brown sugars on this.
Much more.
Huge.
I mean, it's kind of just taking the best of both worlds from the Bookers and the Bakers. And we just, because we've softened it out a bit, you can kind of wrap your head around the fact that there's a lot more flavor there. You can let it envelop your mouth and enjoy it a bit more. The Bookers and the Bakers are a bit more one-directional, but obviously we crank the ABV up so you get that big mouthfeel with them.
It's great. I mean, like, we're talking about, Jim Beam and the small batch range, but we could have easily done a night just on Knob Creek. We could have lined up 4 different Bookers. So I think, we're sort of scratching the surface a little bit, not only one company, but one distillery and one range sort of thing. So, I think, there's so far to go down the rabbit hole of bourbon whiskey. And just from your point of view, Cam, I know I sort of correlate it to, when you get into a style of whiskey, it's like getting into jazz. When I was working in the music industry and trying to get into jazz, it's like a brick wall. Where do you start? But you find an album that you like, find some players that played in the same orchestra on a different album, and you sort of find the common threads through the tree branches. What are the common threads in bourbon that you should be looking to follow? Is it proof? Is it mash bill? Like if this is my first bourbon tasting ever, I go, great, I want to know more. It was number 1 or number 4 was my favorite. What am I looking for next?
Yeah, so I mean, I think mash bill's a big one, right? So if you grab something that's got a straight rye, like almost 100% rye, then you grab something like your Knob Creek rye at 55%. Then you look at your Basil, and if you find what you like the most, like mash bill is probably the first place to start. Mash bill is almost as close to when it comes to like single malt being like, I like smoke or nuts, like I like rye or I like bourbon, like that's kind of the mash bill is essentially where I look first. Then the other part that's often overlooked when it comes to small batch ranges, and it's like, do you like things that are filtered, chill filtered? Do you like that soft finish? Most of your small batch bourbons, like if you look at Wild Turkey and then you look at Russell Reserve, similar thing, another small batch whiskey, has it been filtered? Has it not been filtered? Like, do you like that big, strong finish that comes with the higher ABV, or do you like filtered bourbons? There's plenty of small batch bourbons that have also had a touch of chill filtration as well to soften out that finish. So, and I generally, as a rule, as I said, that'll either be I like small batch or I don't. But really, if you know you like filtered stuff, you can go looking for some of those softer small batch bourbons out there that sit in your mash bill. Then and I guess the next part is like age. Where's the sweet spot for you? Like for me, I know that there's like 12 and 14-year-old bourbons out there, older again, but I don't like them that old. For me, like I like them young and virile and vibrant and with that big sweet finish.
I'm not going there, Cam.
You go there. I mean, I'm the same with my Scotch. I just like distillery characteristics, so I'm less about the wood and more about the juice. If you want to go there, Mike. But yeah, so I think that's probably the 3 things: the mash build you like, whether you like that filtration in there, and then sort of the age you like it at as well. Also, as well, again with distilleries, different distilleries have different ways of putting their stuff together, but you'll find some of the older distilleries kind of do things a bit more the same to some of the younger, newer guys as well. So if you want to explore some of the really different things going on, I guess just widen the net of what you go and explore. As I said, it's not just being made in Kentucky. And even though all the bigger houses are doing some really amazing new releases and playing with some really cool stuff, if you want to see some stuff that really is sitting outside the scope of what we define as bourbon, there are guys sitting in the bourbon laws who are making some really weird, wonderful stuff all around America. So
that's where you sort of, or almost to a point, bring in Maker's Mark, slightly different mash bill, and then you sort of go from the standard to 46 to cask strength to private select. They're all, again, an amazing family within what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And so wheated bourbon from Maker's a lot softer, a much smaller, much more craft distillery. America's first heritage listed distillery. Actually, it's beautiful. If you ever go to Kentucky, it's the one you want to see. But yeah, very different. I know the guys at Woodford, again, just to keep it fair, they've got some cool forward stuff as well. And they're doing things triple distilled rather than double in postil. So, like there is people breaking the mold and ways distilleries are doing things very differently. But yeah, I think mash build and filtration and age are the three components that ultimately define what a whiskey's going to taste like.
And Scott, you were talking about before with Knob Creek. So one of the things that being in the library at the moment, something that's a little bit different is Knob Creek smoked maple.
You're right. Is that wood chipped?
No, it's actually done. So the guys have turned. It's basically almost to like a liqueur. So it's at 90 proof. So it's still right up there. But again, it's something a little bit different when you start talking about what's available out there in the world.
I think there's definitely been an element to America's a big place. A lot of these releases are quite small. Just physically getting access to some of this stuff in Australia has been a challenge in years past, certainly from smaller distilleries. But I think that tide is starting to change, and it's very much amongst drinkers wanting to discover that sort of thing, but also a lot of the great bars that are, sort of specialising in bourbon, and there's heaps of them around the country. Just speaking for Sydney, obviously you've got Nola over in Barangaroo, Surly's, Baxter's American Range is getting better all the time. So like there's heaps of it around, but we're just starting to get access to some of that stuff because they don't need to send it to Australia. They can sell it all in America quite easily. But yeah, it is starting to creep through. I'm noticing more and more, and even from a retailer's point of view, I'm being offered more and more of the weirdest stuff and the wackiest stuff, which is
great. Yeah, there's plenty. As I said, there's plenty of stuff out there that we don't get, unfortunately. Like I know that Booker's has a rye, Basil has a rye. Like there's plenty of stuff out there that we don't get. I mean, if you want it, easiest way to get it is just to drink more of the regular stuff, and they'll send us more of the cool stuff. But yeah.
We ask all the time, Scott, for all the different releases. We are constantly asking, please send it to Australia.
Yeah, and it's very much like one thing I found, and it's not just in bourbon. We're a very loud market. We like to jump up and down and yell and scream, and we want everything, and yes, give it now, and then it doesn't necessarily sell as quickly as we said we were going to drink it, and then America and Scotland and Japan or whoever it is turns around and goes, but you're still sitting on heaps of stuff. Why would we send you the new stuff? So I think that there's an interesting balancing act that I guess is a bit of a peek behind the curtain for people who wonder why certain things arrive and certain things don't.
Yeah, I mean, to give you sort of the long and short of the two things that are a bit of a stitch up for us, essentially when single malt started to be a trend, this is looking at Scotch now just quickly, but bourbon kind of follows a similar trajectory. But when single malt started to be a trend, we kind of led the charge on it. And we were drinking about 23-24% of the world's single malt consumption in Australia because we loved it. We were the first to the party. But as the rest of the world caught up, then it has to be distributed fairly evenly. And when you look at Japanese whiskey, single malt Scotch, and even bourbon, now that the whole world is screaming out for great whiskey and the whiskey rush is on, even though we're back down at like 2-3% of global consumption of these boutique brands, we're still actually per capita being very, very over-resourced as a nation. When you think there's places like India, who's mad for Scotch with 1.2 billion people, China's come to the party now, America's still got like 350 million people calling out for whiskey. Even though we're getting a lot less than what we used to, it's just because the world's gone mad for whiskey. And if you look at us on a per capita basis, we're actually really, really over-resourced by all these global companies.
By a lot.
Sorry?
By a lot.
By a lot, yeah, by a long way per capita. We're a long way over. The second thing is they try and put us in bands of what we'll spend. And the thing about Aussies is we're not cheap. We like to have good staff. but we're also super cheap and don't like to pay a lot of money for it. So
Yeah.
our band of spending, it kind of sits in the sweet zone of the product you're looking at. Like most of us are happy to treat ourselves to about $100 bottle of whiskey. We don't see a lot of the expensive stuff coming here because it just doesn't move that well. And also we don't get a lot of the really cheap stuff either because it just doesn't sell that well here. Like we like sort of mid to high price whiskey and that's our comfort zone and that's what we get. So that's the reason, I guess, for anyone who wonders why we do and don't get things, that's the 2 points in a nutshell. We already get way more than we're supposed to because we're a loud market. We demand and yell and scream and kick about what we don't get. And then the other side of that is, we're getting the stuff that's in the layaway of what we buy the most of. Like if we started spending more money per capita on whiskey, we get more expensive whiskey and vice versa. If we don't keep buying the good stuff, we won't get it. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. I do love the little bit of the peek behind the curtain sort of thing. Getting into final questions, Paul Evans, a very good question. Can you tell us the difference between proof and ABV? I did quickly reply to Paul on that one, but in terms of American ABV, very quickly.
It's just double.
Yeah.
So there is, it's been phased out.
It's actually different to England.
Yeah,
which is really confusing.
Yeah, so English proof has been phased out because it made almost no sense. But it came from the old time back when you used to have proof to be on sailing vessels. So gunpowder or Navy strength or gunpowder strength basically refers to gin and rum where it had to be 57.5% alcohol to be allowed on Navy ships. And that's because if the gunpowder got wet by booze at that strength, it would still ignite, but less than that it wouldn't. So by law, to go on a ship, it had to be that. So they used to call it proof strength. And then, of course, they just called that gin's at proof, that rum's at proof, that whiskey's at proof. And they just called proof 100. And 100 used to be like about 60% or 57% alcohol. So their proof in England just was so hard to work with to ABV. The reason the Yanks, apart from being imperial and slightly backwards, stick with proof over ABV is just because it's a nice, easy measurement from us to them. Like, who cares if they call it proof? It's just double. The English proof had to go because it was just crazy. But.
Yeah. So, and it's on certain bottles, you'll see the ABV listed high and mighty, on others you'll see the proof. And if you see, like, for example, the Bakers we had tonight is 3.5%, 107 proof. So you just either divide your proof by 2 or double your ABV by 2. But guys, thank you very much for taking us through tonight. It's been a lot of fun these last couple of nights talking about terroir from different parts of the world. But Binks does ask a very important question. When's the next one? We do have some other things coming up that aren't bourbon focused. We've got sherry, which is going to be cool, and some rum and that sort of stuff. But basically tomorrow morning, we'll be talking amongst the three of us to find out when we can do this again.
We'll be doing more. Just follow the Oak Barrel and follow the Exchange AUS on Instagram and our Facebook page and our website. And so whether we're doing it or Scotty's doing it, you'll be up to date with all the best stuff. But we'll be clicking our heads together and figuring out what we're doing next. So
we promise we're just as bored as you are.
You're going to
We have for these initial ones, we have focused on products that already had miniatures in the country. Because we like the labels and they look cool, and 50 mils means you get a chance to go back to it afterwards. But also to keep as many hands off things. I don't necessarily want to be pouring things out the back. So we're going to keep working on it. See what else we can come up with. But yeah, this is going to be posted live on the Facebook and the YouTube. Watch it back if you want. If you've got any more questions at any point, shoot me an email. I can forward it across to the boys if I don't know the answer. But thank you very much, everyone across Zoom, Facebook and YouTube. Again, the numbers have been very good and very consistent. Just to, for joining us, and, we'd be doing this whether you guys were here or not, to be fair. So it's always good to have a few other people to drink with as well.
And Scott, thank you very much for inviting us into your home, away from home.
Yeah, I live here now. I'm in isolation with the Oak Barrel.
I thought you were at the back, actually. I thought you had a bit of a sleeping bag.
Yeah. Well, I had the choice: isolate at home or isolate at the Oak Barrel. And I was like, well, I spend more time at the Oak Barrel. Spend more time at the Oak Barrel anyway. So
It's like me. I'm isolating in the library from the rest of the 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks to Michael for doing the hard yards and coming in on his annual leave here, because he's obviously doing it pretty tough.
So tough. Yeah. Thanks to Scott and Obal for having us, and Mike for setting it up, and then for all you guys who've been watching, listening. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much again. As I said, any questions, direct them to Scott, and if I don't know the answer, I'll endeavour to get back to you as soon as I can. So,
cheers, guys. Thanks heaps.
We're gonna take a break, and for anyone else who wants to sit around and talk more whiskey, we'll be back on the Oak Barrel for a bit of a round whiskey discussion in about 8 minutes' time. If anyone else wants to join us. So yeah, we're not going too far, but thank you very much, guys. I'll speak to you soon.
Cheers.
Cheers. Take care.